After OK Computer, Radiohead was in a complete state of disarray. They were burnt out, Tom York was depressed, they just needed a break. When they came back from that break, they all really just had different ideas of where to go from there. Bassist Colin Greenwood felt like the band needed to move on from the sound they had on OK Computer, but Ed O'Brien thought he wanted to stay in that more snappy, guitar-driven melodic sound. In a later interview, York said, quote, "There is absolutely no chance of the album sounding like that. I've completely had it with melody. I just want rhythm. All melodies to me are pure embarrassment." York suffered from major writer's block and had become very weary of rock music. In an interview with The Guardian, he said, quote, "I had always used music as a way of moving on and dealing with things, and I sort of felt like that the thing that helped me deal with things had been sold to the highest bidder, and I was simply doing its bidding. I couldn't handle that." End quote. After OK Computer, York became obsessed with the electronic music of bands like Aphex Twins. This driving and technologic music really pleased York and made him want to make his own. He loved the concept of using your voice as the instrument and using technology to distort it and change your voice to make unique sounds. He was tired of traditional songwriting methods, and this was just the kind of process he was looking for. They started the recording process for Kid A in January of 1999. When York pitched his idea to everybody, they were absolutely not thrilled. I mean, imagine telling your band of 5 people, 3 of which are guitarists, that you don't really want guitars in this album. There's going to be some hurt feelings there. The Greenwood brothers specifically were afraid of sounding like, quote, "random digital experimentation or awful art rock nonsense," end quote, just for its own sake. In according to York, the lead producer, Nigel Godrich, didn't understand why, if we had such strength in one thing, would we want to do something else? But at the same time, he trusted me in the idea I had, in the idea of what I wanted, said York. The recording process of this album was one of experimentation and redefining the members' roles in the band. O'Brien said, "It's scary. Everyone feels insecure. I'm a guitarist. Suddenly it's like there's no guitars in this track or no drums." O'Brien experimented with sustain units on his guitar and many different pedals to create a synthesizer-like sound with his guitar. The band had to completely rework their recording process and methods for this album. We had to develop ways of going off into corners and build things on whatever sequencer, synth, or piece of machinery we would bring to the equation and integrate that into what we normally would work, York said. After a couple different recording sessions in different places, the band had agreed that if they could not agree on the album, they would break up. By the end of 1999, the band had completed 6 tracks, and at the suggestion of their producer, the band split up into 2 groups. One group makes a sound, and the other replicates it on acoustic instruments. This new method is what got the band fully on board for this new direction. They were so convinced of this new direction, they had recorded enough tracks for a double album. And the argument over whether to release both albums or split them up into one almost brought the band to a breakup, according to O'Brien. But luckily they stuck through it and decided to save the other half of the tracks for their next album, Amnesiac. Now, in terms of quality, Kid A is my personal favorite Radiohead album, and it's honestly one of my favorite albums of all time. The vibe it creates, with its many different sounds and recording processes, it still leaves me in awe, and I can't even imagine what it sounded like on October of 2000 when it first released. The opening chords on the opening track, Everything in Its Right Place, sound so good in my ears. I've probably listened to this album 50 times. They still give me chills down my spine. They just sound so right. The cut-up and nonsensical lyrics, which York stated, he put them... I can't attribute this quote to anybody, I just heard it somewhere, but apparently he put, cut-up pieces of paper that had lyrics on them in a hat, and then he pulled them out. That's what gives you lyrics on the opening track, lyrics like, "Yesterday I woke up sucking on a lemon," or "There are 2 colors in my head." They don't really make sense, and that's why. And it's a little weird upon the first listen, but eventually they just become part of the arrangement and a lot of the instrumentation, and they just blend right in. The second and the title track, Kid A, is a repetitive and looping slow burner with driving distorted drum beats behind the whole 4-minute runtime, and it is absolutely perfectly accompanied by York's vocals drenched in distortions and effects. The next track, the National Anthem, is one of, if not my favorite Radiohead track of all time. Its eerie looping bass runs and drum beat, with what I can only describe as spooky ghost noises in the distance, create such a clear vibe I can't even put words to it. This is one of the few tracks to feature York's vocals without much distortion, like the usual. And like the usual, the lyrics don't really make sense. Halfway through this song comes a ripping tenor sax solo, just screaming over the rest of the arrangement. And it's followed by the rest of the brass band with their out-of-time trumpet screams and just cacophony of noise. National Anthem sounds like a Manic episode translated into music, and I could listen to a whole album of it. This song very well might be perfect in my ears. The fourth song on the record, How to Disappear Completely, contrasts its neighbor, the National Anthem, with a more softer acoustic feel, almost sounding like the aftermath of a manic state we just listened to the track before. It's swelled with York's non-distorted vocals accompanied with a singing string section on top of the foundation set by the rhythm section that leaves you floating into the next track, Tree Fingers. It's honestly nothing special. It's a really ambient number, and it sounds like it belongs on a film score rather than a Radiohead record. But after the 4 bangers we just listened to, it's a nice little break to just catch your breath a little bit. The ambient vibes are broken once again on the next track, Optimistic, with its driving tom rhythms and the drums laying the backbeat for some real guitar sounds, accompanied by York's vocals. This track sounds like it would fit quite nicely on OK Computer with his more traditional rock sound, but it fits pretty well on Kid A as well. It's a good mix. This track ends with a really funky bass and drum passage that leads perfectly into the next number, In Limbo. In Limbo starts out with a plucky guitar solo that introduces layers and layers of the band, just kind of doing their own thing, everyone just going with the flow, no one really breaking the mold. Followed by York's reverb and slightly distorted vocals coming out of the mix, ending with York and the band becoming more and more distorted as the sound dissolves into just sound. The next track, Idiotech, features a distorted dance beat as its bass while York just rambles over the top of it. That may sound unappealing, but it's a pretty good track, and it's honestly one of the highlights of the album. It features most of the vocal performance out of any of the tracks, and the beat in the background is a nice little dance beat. If I had to liken it to anything, it'd be like if York went to a disco and was just having an episode. It just kind of sounds like that. The eerie sounds carry directly into the next song, Morning Bell, where they're quickly joined by another looping drum beat, accompanied by a synth and York's nonsense vocals. Morning Bell is honestly probably one of the more forgettable ones behind Tree Fingers, but it's still really, really good and contributed quite nicely to the vibe of the record, but it is one of the less unique ones compared to the others. The penultimate track, Motion Picture Soundtrack, opens with a very heavily distorted, but still quite recognizable church organ, soon joined by York's melancholic and drawing vocals along with harp samples and synths to create an atmosphere reminiscent of, as the title may suggest, a film soundtrack. The last track on the album is a less than a minute instrumental piece called Untitled. There's not really much to it, it's just a nice way to close out this absolute masterpiece. Upon first release, critics were pretty confused and disappointed at Radiohead's follow-up to OK Computer. The publication Mojo said that Kid A is, quote, just awful. It too often sounds like fragments that they began the writing process with, a loop, a riff, a muffled line of text, have been set in concrete, and had other lesser ideas piled on top of it. Pretty scathing review there. But in retrospect, critics truly saw the potential of the album, and it has been named Album of the 2000s by Pitchfork and ranked 20th on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. Now, any artist that releases one or more genre or career-defining albums as successful as OK Computer or Kid A would be pretty happy with their career. But Radiohead had released 2 decade-defining albums, and they were just not finished. OK Computer was a defining album of the 1990s, and even though it came out right in the first year of the 2000s, Kid A was still a defining album of the 2000s and paved the way for modern-day electronic music, and that let artists know that if they found their stride in one sound, they could easily transition to another one, just like Radiohead did. After Kid A and Amnesiac, the band released their 6th studio album, Hail to the Thief. It's a pretty average critical success. It's nothing special. It's just another, I mean, in Radiohead standards, it's not much special. If any other artist made that, it'd probably be their best album. But Radiohead's discography is so stacked, Hail to the Thief is quite average. After Hail to the Thief was released, the group was out of their 6-album contract with EMI, and they were free to do as they pleased. So they started by taking a break. On this break, the group spent time with their family and they worked on solo projects. York released his first solo album, The Eraser, 2006, and Johnny Greenwood started his career scoring films for director friend Paul Thomas Anderson on a film like There Will Be Blood in 2007. During this break, the band made a couple attempts to get back into the studio, but this time they had a new producer. These sessions didn't really amount to anything solid, and in an attempt to try and break the writer's block, they decided to go on tour. They used this tour to really test out different tracks they were writing for their new project, and it had really reignited their band's love for music. York said, quote, "We basically had all these half-formed songs, and we just had to put them together. And rather than it being a nightmare, it was actually really, really good fun. Because suddenly everyone was being spontaneous again. There was no one self-conscious because you're not in the studio. It felt like we were 16 again." End quote. After the tour, the band started the recording process for their new album, In Rainbows, with their old producer, Nigel Godrich. The music of this record is honestly fantastic. It's the perfect combination of everything Radiohead had learned and perfected over their career. It was a nice mix of electronic music, with elements they have used for Kid A and the more traditional acoustic sounds found in OK Computer, and these styles mended flawlessly. The first two tracks, 15 Step and Body Snatchers, are more traditional rock numbers, which benefit from the effects and elements of electronic music, but also holding the true soul of rock music in them, and they are just fantastic. The third track, Nude, is a track that was recorded and tried out all the way back in OK Computer, but it was put to the side to be re-recorded here in the In Rainbow sessions. Its jazzy and smooth feel set a tone different to that of the first two tracks, but still amazing in its own right. Its lounge-style drum feels accompanied by string samples and York's unique vocals make it for a very enjoyable listen and a wonderful addition to the record. The next track, Weird Fishes and Arpeggi, gives a more jam band experimental vibe, really showcasing the feeling of being 16 again, because this sounds like just some friends just having a good time jamming in their garage. The consistent drums with the dynamic and ambient guitars all enhance York's more spacey vocal performance, and they work together to create a really cohesive sound throughout the ensemble. The next three tracks, All I Need, Fast Harp, and The Reckoner, are our slower tracks with their own special qualities, but they're a pretty forgettable section of the album. All good tracks, but in terms of the album, pretty forgettable. The next track, House of Cards, is a beautiful ballad about unconditional love between two people, accented with heavy reverb on York's vocals, backed up by a slowly plucked acoustic guitar and a soft drum beat. Occasionally overshadowed by a far-distant screaming electric guitar sound during the swelled sections. A really good track overall, House of Cards. The next track, Jigsaw Falling Into Place, is a quick and loud number, which is one of the more rock and roll sounding Radiohead tracks since OK Computer, and they honestly sound like they never left the OK Computer days with this track. Starting with a low drum beat surrounded by soft vocals themselves, soon followed by a quiet Tom York, almost sounding like a soft rock singer, but the song quickly picks up intensity in the vocals and instrumentation, morphing into a quick, driving rock number, and honestly one of my favorites on the album, and has slowly become one of my favorites in Radiohead's discography, over listening to these albums for this recording. The closer is a slow funeral march videotape, defined by its consistent piano notes and stripped-back York vocals, not accompanied by much more than a synth and some drum swells here. Videotape is actually a really good example of how songs morphed from their festival and their tour to how they sound on the album. When Videotape was recorded on tour, it was quick and jumpy, a lot like the end of Jigsaw Falling Into Place. It was a quick, like, driving rock number, but then when it comes onto the album, they cut the tempo in half, or so we think. They cut the tempo in half, and it's this slow funeral march. But there's a great video by Vox, actually, describing the hidden rhythms inside videotape. It's too much music theory for me to get into right now, but it's a fantastic video describing how this record went from how it sounded on the tour to how it sounded on the album. Great video. The innovation on this album, however, is not found in the track list like the Kid A and OK Computer. It is found in the way that music was given to the public. Not bound by a label, Radiohead could have released this however they wanted. They decided on a model that had never been used by an artist as big as Radiohead before. Pay what you want online release. 10 days before its release, Johnny Greenwood put a post on the band's blog Dead Airspace saying, quote, "Well, the new album is finished. It's coming out in 10 days. We've called it In Rainbows," end quote. And they did just what they said. 10 days later, they released the album as a pay what you want, and you could download it online. This release paved the way for online music distribution that was so feared by companies at the time because of the rampant pirating and torrenting that was so prevalent on the internet. Radiohead saw this and thought, what if we just give them the music for free and see what happens? And what happened was, according to Tom York, the band made more money off In Rainbows digitally than all the other Radiohead albums combined. I personally believe this release paved the way for free music streaming services like Spotify and pay-what-you-want services like Bandcamp that helps artists get their music far and wide as possible using the internet. I think this because in 2007, the internet was a scary place. It was fairly unmoderated, and sites like Napster were really feared by the music industry, and everyone was just very wary to put things online for fear of redistribution without their consent and things like that. But Radiohead saw the internet as a great way to put music out to more people using a digital platform. And after their success, I'm sure a lot of other artists gravitated towards it. And that has snowballed into what we see today with music streaming, YouTube music, things like that. The internet is basically overrun by music. It's an amazing thing. Yeah. After In Rainbows, the band had released 2 studio albums. In 2011, they released King of Limbs, again, fairly average critical success. It's not one of their best albums, but it lives up to their Radiohead quality. Their most recent release, A Moon-Shaped Pool in 2016, released a very positive critical reception. It's quite depressing, very much a slower record, but it's a great addition to the band's discography. I believe Radiohead will go down as the greatest rock band, one of the greatest rock bands in history, because of their constant innovation on the scene throughout the 90s and the 2000s. The 3 albums I've mentioned, OK Computer, Kid A, and In Rainbows, changed the way music is made, the way music sounds, and the way music is distributed, respectively, and has set the standard for years to come for the industry. Despite all this innovation, Radiohead has managed to make 3 absolutely fantastic records that would be career definers on their own, but together make these 5 boys from Oxford's a legend.